C-Day, June 6, 1944. The deadliest invasion in history. But what if the soldiers who fell on Omaha Beach didn't stay down? What if they stood back up and started attacking their own brothers? This is what happens when the zombie apocalypse collides with World War II, a three-way war between the Allies, the Nazis, and the reanimated dead. And I'm about to show you exactly how it plays out. Here's where things get complicated, because the military infrastructure of 1944 is simultaneously the best and worst possible system to face a zombie outbreak. On one hand, you've got millions of trained soldiers, established chains of command, weapons stockpiles that dwarf anything available to modern civilians, and a population already conditioned to follow orders and accept rationing. On the other hand, you've got massive troop concentrations, close quarters combat as standard operating procedure, and military doctrine that's entirely built around fighting human enemies who stay dead when you shoot them.
What makes the initial military response both effective and catastrophic is that nobody knows the rules yet. The 1 minute to 8 hour reanimation window is absolutely brutal for battlefield medicine. Medics are trained to triage, to save who they can, to move the wounded to field hospitals where dozens of injured soldiers are concentrated in tight spaces. Like, imagine you're a combat medic and you've just dragged 3 wounded guys back to the aid station. You're working on the one you think you can save. Behind you, the one who died 2 minutes ago sits up and bites the doctor who was filling out his death certificate. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, you've got an outbreak in the one place where the most vulnerable wounded are concentrated. The 8-hour window is somehow worse. A soldier dies in combat at 0600. His body is recovered, processed, tagged, and sent to the rear with a dozen other casualties. At 1300, somewhere in a supply truck or a temporary morgue or a field grave registration unit, he reanimates. Nobody's watching for it. Nobody's prepared. The infection spreads through support units, through headquarters staff, through the supply lines that keep armies functioning. But hands down, the military has one massive advantage: communication infrastructure and the ability to adapt doctrine rapidly when survival depends on it. Once high command accepts what's happening, and with physical evidence literally trying to eat them, acceptance comes faster than you'd think. Information spreads through official channels. New standing orders get issued. Every unit receives the same critical intelligence. Destroy the brain, death isn't permanent. Treat every casualty as a potential threat. Establish quarantine protocols.
This is where the timeline gets absolutely critical. It's early June 1944. D-Day is scheduled for June 6th. The largest military operation in history is about to launch, and the Allied command is receiving reports that the dead are walking. What do? Do you cancel the invasion? Do you proceed and hope you can contain whatever this is? Do you even tell the troops what they're about to face? The invasion proceeds because it has to. Years of planning, millions of tons of supplies, hundreds of thousands of troops already in position. You can't just call it off because of reports that sound like they came from a horror radio show. But the briefings change. Officers receive classified addendums to their orders. Shoot for the head. Don't let wounded soldiers reanimate behind your lines. Establish secure perimeter protocols for casualty collection points. What makes the Normandy invasion uniquely catastrophic in a zombie outbreak scenario is the sheer density of casualties in a confined space. Omaha Beach alone sees thousands of Allied soldiers killed in the initial assault. In the original timeline, those bodies lie where they fell or wash out with the tide. In this timeline, by the time the first wave establishes a beachhead, the second wave is facing not just German machine gun fire, but reanimated American soldiers rising from the surf. The real terror isn't the Atlantic Wall defenses. It's watching your brothers in arms, guys who died heroically 30 minutes ago, stumbling back toward you with dead eyes and snapping jaws. But here's the thing about Season 1 walkers that changes everything. They're fast enough and smart enough to be a genuine tactical threat, but they're not so overwhelming that organized military force can't handle them. A shambling zombie horde is a cleanup operation. A running, thinking zombie horde is a combat situation. And combat is what these armies are built for. The Allied forces adapt. Flamethrowers, which were already being used against German fortifications, become primary anti-zombie weapons. Artillery protocols change to include saturation bombardment of areas with high casualty counts. Every unit assigns dedicated soldiers to watch the wounded and the dead.
Low-key, the German military is facing an even worse situation.
They've been at war since 1939, fighting on multiple fronts, taking massive casualties on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. If the zombie virus has been spreading since early June, the Wehrmacht has been dealing with reanimation in the field for weeks before D-Day. They just didn't have a framework to understand it. The Eastern Front becomes an absolute nightmare scenario. The brutal combat between German and Soviet forces has been producing casualties at a rate that dwarfs anything in the West. Stalingrad alone killed nearly 2 million people. If even a fraction of those casualties reanimated before the virus was understood, you're looking at zombie hordes on a scale that makes any modern zombie fiction look quaint. The real genius of the virus emerging in 1944 rather than earlier is that it hits when Germany is already stretched to breaking point. When resources are depleted, when the military is fighting a losing war on multiple fronts. German military doctrine, which emphasizes rapid movement and combined arms warfare, is actually reasonably well suited to dealing with fast zombies. Panzer divisions can outmaneuver Walker hordes. The German emphasis on tactical flexibility means unit commanders can adapt to the new threat without waiting for orders from high command. But the strategic situation is impossible. They're fighting a two-front war against the largest military coalitions in history. And now they're also fighting their own dead.
This is high-key where the zombie outbreak either ends humanity or gets contained, because the Eastern Front is operating on a scale that's almost incomprehensible. The Soviet Union has been throwing millions of soldiers into combat, accepting casualty rates that would break any other nation, relying on sheer numerical superiority and willingness to sacrifice. That strategy becomes suicidal when your casualties reanimate and attack your own lines. But what makes the Soviet response potentially effective is the absolute ruthlessness of Stalin's regime. There's no debate about whether the reports are real. There's no ethical hand-wringing about shooting soldiers who might just be wounded. The NKVD establishes barrier troops whose sole job is to shoot anyone who falls and doesn't get back up within 60 seconds. Entire units that show signs of infection are written off and eliminated with artillery. It's brutal. It's horrific, and it's probably the most effective possible response to a fast zombie outbreak in a military context. The Soviet industrial capacity, which has been relocated east of the Urals and is producing tanks and weapons at an incredible rate, pivots to support anti-zombie operations. Flamethrower production increases. Protocols for mass cremation of casualties get implemented. The same totalitarian control that makes the Soviet Union such a nightmare for its own citizens becomes the mechanism for enforcing quarantine and containment measures that democratic governments would struggle to implement. By mid-June 1944, the outbreak isn't contained to the battlefield. Casualties are being shipped home. Soldiers on leave are carrying the infection back to London, to Moscow, to Berlin, to every city connected to the war effort. What makes civilian outbreak scenarios in 1944 different from modern zombie fiction is the existing infrastructure of civil defense, rationing, and government control. Britain, which has been under threat of invasion and bombardment since 1940, already has blackout protocols, air raid wardens, civil defense networks, and a population conditioned to follow emergency instructions. When the BBC broadcasts emergency instructions about The Walking Dead, people listen. When the government implements quarantine zones, people comply, because they've been complying with wartime restrictions for 5 years already. The London Underground, which served as bomb shelters during the Blitz, becomes a network of secure zones. The Home Guard, which was organized to resist German invasion, pivots to zombie containment. The United States, protected by two oceans and not facing direct threat of invasion, has the luxury of implementing containment measures before the outbreak reaches critical mass on American soil.
Ports become quarantine checkpoints. Returning casualties are isolated and monitored. The industrial capacity that's been producing tanks and planes and ships pivots partially to support containment operations overseas. But hands down, America's biggest advantage is that the zombie outbreak is happening over there, giving time to prepare, to learn from what's happening in Europe, to implement protocols before the infection spreads domestically.
Like, here's the thing about fast, smart zombies in a World War II context. They're terrifying, but they're not insurmountable. They can run, but they can't outrun vehicles. They can problem solve, but they can't operate weapons or coordinate tactics. They're a threat that organized military force can handle, especially once the rules are understood. Destroy the brain, contain the casualties, cremate the dead, establish secure perimeters. These aren't complicated protocols, and by mid-1944, every major military has the resources and organization to implement them. The real question is whether containment happens before the outbreak reaches critical mass. If the infection spreads faster than it can be contained, if zombie numbers reach the point where they overwhelm military response capacity, then you're looking at a genuine apocalypse scenario. But if the military response is fast enough, brutal enough, and coordinated enough, then the zombie outbreak becomes another horror of World War II, another nightmare that has to be survived and overcome. What makes this scenario fascinating is that it hits at the moment when the Allies are transitioning from defense to offense, when the industrial and military capacity of the Allied powers is reaching its peak, when coordination between the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union is at its most effective. The D-Day invasion, which in our timeline was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, becomes a three-way battle between Allied forces, German defenders, and the reanimated dead of both sides. By the time the Normandy beachhead is secured, every army involved has adapted. Casualty protocols have changed. Flamethrower units are standard in every company. Field cremation is mandatory. The war continues, but it's a different war now. Fought against human enemies who have to be killed twice, and an infection that turns every battlefield into a potential outbreak zone. The zombie virus doesn't end World War II. It makes it worse. More brutal, more horrific than it already was. But it doesn't end humanity. Because humanity in 1944 is already organized for total war, already mobilized for survival, already conditioned to face horrors and keep fighting. The dead walk, and the living learn to put them down permanently. That's the story, that's the nightmare. That's how things play out when the zombie apocalypse meets the largest military conflict in human history.